So, good morning to everybody. First of all, my name is Enrico Battisti. I'm a senior lecturer of corporate finance at the University of Turin. Professor Salvi is coming, so I receive a specific instruction in order to present Professor Almeida, that is our visiting professor and the second lecturer of this course. Let me introduce Professor Almeida. Almeida, Hector, is a Stanley and Golder Chair in Corporate Finance and Academic Director of High Degrees of Giant College Business. He joined the University of Illinois in 2007 and also works as a research associate for a National Bureau of Economic Research. His research specialties include financial constraints, liquidity management, business groups, financial distress, innovation, and stock repurchases. He served as associate editor of different financial journals, especially, for example, Journal of Financial Intermediation and Journal of Banking and Finance. He will become managing editor of the Journal of Corporate Finance in January 2021. So, thank you very much for this opportunity, and also Professor Salvi is coming and probably he will arrive during the coffee break. So, thank you very much. I know that there are many students that are also connected online, but it's a great pleasure to see many students face to face in this group. Okay, Nicolo is here if you have any kind of problem.
Okay.
Nicolo,
good morning, Enrico. I'm Felice.
Felice.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much, and I want to say goodbye to Professor Almeida. I'm very pleased to meet him also virtually, but I'm sure that there will be the possibility to him in person as soon as possible.
Okay. We have two different teaching assistants, one online and one face-to-face here. So, okay, thank you very much. Have a nice lesson.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Hector Almeida, and I'm happy to be here teaching, talking about corporate finance with you. Of course, it's what I do. And what I did for this course, based on what Antonio told me, is I selected a few topics that I really like to talk about, and I thought would be appropriate. The mic is a little, we're still trying to figure out here the logistics, right? So do I have to stand back there? No.
Yeah,
right?
how is that? No.
Okay, all right. So, I know we have some people online, right? So we'll figure it out. We basically are going to try to talk about three topics. I know it's a lot of material, right, to cover in 3 days, right? So, yes. Okay, we have 27 people online. Yeah. Is the sound okay? Yeah, okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some theoretical concepts first. For example, I'm going to talk about how firms issue security. We're going to talk about debt issuance, equity issuance, and then what I'm going to do is just to introduce some cases that I prepared for my lectures. I should start by talking about myself a little bit. I have been teaching corporate finance and mergers and acquisitions at the University of Illinois for many years, and I teach in MBA classes, PhD. I've also taught undergraduate, so pretty much everything. So this is and it's like I said at the beginning, it's very nice to be here. So the plan, as you can see there, I have some topics that are called mini cases. That's where I'm going to try to introduce some real world cases for you. Ideally, right, I mean, it would be nice if you had looked at the case beforehand, but since it's so short, I realized that would probably not be a good idea. So just going to talk about the case here. And then, so it's basically three topics. We're going to talk about how firms issue securities. That has to do, of course, with capital structure, which is a topic that you covered with Professor Salvi already, right? Then we're going to talk about payout policy and risk and liquidity management. Okay, so those are the three broad topics. And in security issuance, we're going to be talking about issuing debt and equity, right? Those are the basic ways that companies can finance themselves. So we're going to talk about different types of debts, how companies choose between different types of debt, and then we're going to talk about equity issuance. So when is it that companies find it optimal to issue equity, and give you some examples of that. Talk a little bit about venture capital, which is also one way, it's one situation in which companies finance themselves using equity. And then we're going to talk about payout policy, and then finally, like I said, we're going to talk about risk and liquidity management. Okay, so I changed the names of the lectures a little bit relative to the syllabus, but we can figure that out. It's not a problem. So next one. And by the way, so if you have any questions at any point, just stop me. Okay, it's always good to have participation, of course. And it's we really welcome questions. It's very hard for me because it's the first time I see you, so to know exactly what you have done, what you know, what you don't know. So, if there is something that, if I'm going too fast, please stop me and say, please explain it again, okay? Hopefully it's not going to be too slow for you, right, based on what you know already. But any questions about the material, you can also email me. I have an email here at the university now, but you can use my Illinois email. Let me actually write it down here. Okay, so this is my email. If you have any questions about the material or a general question about corporate finance, something that you're thinking about, that anything, just email me there. Okay, if you have any feedback also, we have 3 days, right? So if you have any feedback about the classes and things you could do different, in these 3 days, also feel free to let me know. Okay, so how do I change slides? Good point. Okay.
I think the only way is with the mouse.
Okay.
Because if you don't have
and
do you prefer to have the PowerPoint instead of the?
Yeah, I think PowerPoint would be better. Yeah. This is not in presentation mode, right?
No, because it's not PowerPoint.
Yeah, you are sharing your screen.
Well, let's try. So this one doesn't go on presentation mode. System. Yeah, see? It goes. Now let's see how it should switch. Yeah. I think this works.
Yeah, it's working.
Yeah. The mouse doesn't work. I have to use this. Okay, so we're going to be talking about how companies issue securities, what type of securities do they issue, when do they issue, okay? So we're going to actually start talking about the basics. So essentially, right, so when companies need to raise cash from investors, they're going to use either debt or equity, right? We probably talked about that with Antonio already. It's also important to think about when companies are, right, so why is it that companies are going to issue securities? Typically, firms need to raise cash from investors when they finance new investments, right? So capital expenditures, research and development, mergers and acquisitions. We're going to be talking about, actually, it turns out that mergers and acquisitions is a very good laboratory to study corporate financial policy because those are very large investments. And so some of the best examples that I can give of how companies issue securities actually come from M&A. So we're going to be talking about M&A here as well. So, but then there is also other situations that are also in some cases are important in practice. So companies refinance existing debt, right? So when you have some debt coming due, you issue new debt to refinance or to make payments to suppliers. And in some cases, companies can issue debt to re-optimize capital structure. But we're going to be focusing mostly on the first bullet point. So, financing new investments is the key reason why companies issue securities. Okay? So we're going to be talking first about debt and we're going to talk about debt and equity. And let me actually start with an example. So this is this is an example with some data from a real-world company. This is PepsiCo, right? Which you probably know. Right? It's a very famous company. So what I did here is I actually took some data from the financial statements of PepsiCo, and then I'm kind of assuming, so this is an assumption here that PepsiCo needs to finance some new investments. So suppose they have a large investment plan, so they need to invest $3.5 billion in 2015 and then $6.5 billion in 2016. So the question is, how can the company finance this expansion, right? So in some cases, the company might be able to invest to make these investments using internal funds. The way you figure it out is by looking at the financial statement. Okay, so you don't have to, you don't have to look at all the details there, but this is a these are projected financial statements for PepsiCo using real world data. Okay. But where I introduced it in the bold there, you can see the capital expenditures that the company is planning to finance. So I'm supposing that we are in December 2014, that's when I was doing this example, okay? And then the company has these capital expenditures, you can see there in bold, okay? And then what the cash flow statement of the company will tell you is what's going to happen to the company's cash, right? So if the company has enough cash flows to finance investment, then you're going to have a positive change in cash. What you can see here is that this expansion plan for PepsiCo is causing the company's cash balances to decrease, right, by $2.6 billion. That's because the cash flows from operations are not sufficient to finance the debt. Okay, so that's really all you have to take away from this. And so if of course what the company could do is to use its cash reserves, right? Companies have cash balances that they keep. They could use these cash balances to finance the investment, but the company may not want to do that. So in some situations, the company is going to want to raise new funds, right? So let's suppose in this case that PepsiCo is going to raise $5 billion to finance this expansion plan during 2015. Okay, so the company is issuing $5 billion, and then now what PepsiCo needs to think about is, are we going to issue debt, right? Is this investment going to be financed with debt, or is it going to be financed with equity? Okay. So And the first thing I want to talk about is really the basics, what I call the mechanics, right? So what happens to companies' numbers through the financial statement when they issue debt, when they issue equity, and then we're going to use that to talk about the costs, right, of debt and equity. So we have this $5 billion, right, issuance, and let's start with the debt, okay? So of course, if a company issues debt, you're going to have to pay interest, right? So there is a cost, monetary cost, which is the interest rate. So we don't know exactly, well, this is a made up example, right? So let's assume that the interest rate is 4%. That would be not a, that's not a bad assumption. That's probably about at that time, that's probably the interest rate that PepsiCo would be paying, okay? So this means that PepsiCo is going to be paying an interest, an annual, and this is annual, 4% per year. So PepsiCo is going to be paying an interest rate of $200 million every year, okay? So if we go back to the financial statement, then of course what's going to happen, so this is the company's income statement now, right? So this is what the income statement was before the debt issuance, right? So you see there is revenues and costs, etc. EBIT, right, which is operating income, and then you have you have interest expense, right? So PepsiCo was paying $1.2 billion, $1.15 billion in interest. This is real world data, like I said. So what will happen is that your interest expense is going to go up, right? So it's going to go up from 1.1 billion to 1.356. Okay? So interest expense goes up, so that reduces the company's earnings, right? So you are less profitable because you're paying interest. Okay? And so you can see here this all the changes are in bold, right? So your earnings go down. Okay? And then the benefit, of course, is now when we go back to the cash flow statement, right, that we started with, right? So this is what's going to happen here is that now the company is generating cash, right? You have a positive change in cash in 2015 because of the borrow, right? So the amount of money that the company borrows from investors is going to come in, right, as a cash inflow, and it's going to be reflected in the cash flow statement, right? So now you can see that PepsiCo really, right, because you're losing $3 billion in 2014, but then you're generating $5 billion, right? So then, you're kind of breaking even, right? So you don't need, now the company doesn't need to reduce its cash flow, it's just finance using that, okay? So, and now let's think about equity. Okay, so this is the mechanic, right, of what happens when a company issues debt. Now let's think about equity. So suppose that instead of issuing debt, right, so issuing $5 billion in debt to investors, suppose now that PepsiCo is going to sell equity, right? Issuing equity means that you're selling new shares to investors at a certain price, right? So at that time, the stock price of the company was $94 a share. So if you issue $5 billion, right, then we can calculate here the number of new shares that the company has to issue, right? So PepsiCo is going to sell those number of shares. It's 53 million, basically 53 million shares, a little bit more than that, right? So what's going to happen in the financial statement? Okay, so in terms of the income statement, right, the company's profitability really doesn't change, right? There is no item in the income statement that is going to capture the equity issuance, right? So now you're not paying interest, so your earnings are the same, okay? And of course you're going to have the benefit, right? Here in the cash flow statement, instead of money coming from borrowing, what's going to happen is there's going to be a net issuance of stock, right? So the company is going to get $5 billion in new cash that is going to come in, and then you have pretty much the same effect as you had with the debt issuance, right? So then the company is going to raise the company is going to raise cash through the equity issuance. Okay? So what I like to do, when I'm teaching is always have a place to stop and think about questions, right? So in the case of that, it was very easy to see, right, that the company is getting cash from investors and then you are paying interest, right? So there is a benefit, there is a cost. So what is the cost of issuing equity? Let's see who wants to. Right, so you're not paying any interest, your income statement was the same, your profitability is the same, right? You're getting $5 billion. What's the cost?
Dividends.
That's the first thing that you think about. Okay, it turns out that that's not the right way to think about it. Okay, no, it's not dividends. Let's see. Huh? Yeah, it has to do with dilution of control, right? But more simply, what is it? What's the cost?
You lose control.
Yeah, you're issuing more shares,
Shares.
right? So you're issuing more shares. So you're dividing. It's not so, there's not going to be a dilution of control with the issuance of $53 million for PepsiCo, but you can think in those terms, right? So you're going to be issuing new shares and giving the new shares to new investors. So you're dividing the same profits, right, among more people. That's the way to think about it. Okay. So dividend, right? So essentially what happens is that the number of shares outstanding goes up, right, by $53.191 million. So, and by the way, I'm gonna have the answers here, but every time I do a question, just try to think, and make sure you understand what's going on. Okay. So PepsiCo profits are going to be divided among a larger number of people. Okay, so that's the way to think about it. If you want to think about that as dilution, typically control, right? We think about control in corporate finance as the ability to make decisions, right? So these new shareholders that you're bringing in are probably not going to have a significant impact on the control of the company, but they are going to get some of the cash. Right? So the cost is not really that you're paying more dividends. The cost is that the cost is that you're bringing in more investment. Okay, so I actually like to talk about that. Okay, so that was your first answer, right? Paying dividends. And when I forecasted my financial statements here, I actually assumed that dividends were constant. Okay, and the reason why you shouldn't think of paying dividends as a cost, in accounting language, right? Interest and dividends would be very similar. So that's why you thought of dividends, stock, dividends, debt, interest, right? But remember that paying dividends is a choice of the company, right? You don't have to pay dividends. And that's actually one of the topics we're going to talk about, right? Why do firms pay dividends? That's what we call payout policy. Okay, so when you think about this, it really can't be the cost, right? Because it's a choice. So you can issue new equity and don't change dividends at all, which is the way I did it here. Okay, everybody understand that? Okay, so basics, right? The issuing debt, you get cash, you have to pay interest. When you issue equity, right, you get cash and you issue more shares. Okay? So now what we're going to talk about is, one of the important concepts, one of the most important concepts in finance, which is this notion of market efficiency. And rather than giving like a theoretical lecture about market efficiency, what I chose to do here is to talk about market efficiency in the context of debt and equity. Okay, what does it mean? And it turns out that there is a very simple way that we can think about market efficiency that has to do with some concepts you learned before in other finance work. Okay? So, any question on the first? So I like to divide it by, small lectures like that, just to make sure that, we know exactly what we're covering at that point, but this is really a continuation. Okay? So, the basic tool that I was talking about is what we call net present value, right? So, which I'm sure, in a previous finance class, you must have talked about net present value, right? So, in corporate finance, we use net present value to make any type of financial decisions, right? So, for example, when a company invests in a new project, right, then, we have to calculate, we have to estimate the net present value of the new project, right? And the company takes the project if net present value is positive. Okay? Net present value should apply to anything. So the way that theoretically, right, the way that PepsiCo should be thinking about that previous question, right, we were talking about, should you issue the debt, should you issue equity, okay? What NPV would tell us is that the company should issue debt when the NPV of issuing debt is bigger than the NPV of issuing equity, right? And you should issue equity when the NPV of issuing equity is bigger than the NPV of issuing debt, right? So what we're going to try to do is to think about what should be the net present value of the debt issue. Okay? So now in the previous lecture, we already figured out what the benefit and the costs are, right? So PepsiCo is issuing a bond, and here, let's say it's a 5-year bond. Okay? This really doesn't matter, what the maturity of the bond is, but to calculate NPV, we have to make an assumption about maturity. So let's say that it's a 5-year bond, okay? And now we, rather than accounting, right? I showed you how the accounting looks like. Now we're doing more finance, right? So what you have here is an expression, right? Where you try to calculate the NPV of the investment, right? So NPV has cash inflows and cash outflows, right? So in this formula, what you have is the plus 5, right? That is the money coming in, okay? And then the company is paying interest, right? The minus 0.2 here. This is the $200 million interest payment, right? And then at the end of the maturity period, the company is going to pay back the $5.2 billion. Okay? So, I don't have the answer there, right? What do you think the answer should be? What's going to be the NPV? Yeah, it's a mathematical equation, right? You can calculate. But let's think about intuition. What should it be? 0. Yes. Okay? Who said that? Good. Okay? That is, it turns out that this is a very useful way to think about market efficiency. Okay? What market efficiency means is that the NPVs are 0. And this is the concept that I'm going to be emphasizing here. The NPV of a financial decision should always be close to 0. Okay? And if you work out this equation, you're actually going to find that the NPV is 0. Okay, and I see some puzzled faces. I think you're going to understand that. But if you do the math here, you can do it in Excel or whatever there, you're going to find out the 0 NPV. Okay? So the NPV is 0. And you might be asking, why did I discount, right? So there is a discount rate in that formula, right? Which is the 4%. Clearly, what I did there is I discounted the cash flows using the interest rate. Okay, that's why the NPV is 0. And really, the logic works backwards. Okay, I kind of knew that the NPV has to be 0, which means that the discount rate has to be the same as the interest rate. Okay, but remember, NPV 0 is a very useful concept when we think about financial decisions. Okay, and here's the intuition, right? If the debt is fairly priced, right, if the debt, right, market efficiency has to do with the market, right? When the market is efficient, what should happen is that the interest rate should be the same as the discount rate, right? And here you can remember if you study, when you study net present value in a previous class, right? What we use for the discount rate in corporate finance is some notion of required return, right? What the discount rate is the minimum required return that an investor requires to invest in that project, security, whatever it is, right? So what the zero NPV means really is that the cost of issuing debt, right, which is the $200 million interest payment, is exactly compensated by the benefits of the cash coming in, right? That's what this equation is. What this equation is doing it has both the benefit, right, the plus 5, and then the minuses, right? And this, what efficient markets mean is that debt is fairly priced, which means that the NPV is zero. Okay? So that's the way to think about it. Any question on this? And of course, we're also going to talk, you can think about what happens when you have violations, right, of market efficiency. And then, of course, you're going to have a pure benefit of issuing debt, or in some cases, reducing debt, right? So, for example, suppose that the discount rate is 3.5%. So an investor requires only 3.5% to lend money to the firm, to the company, but the company is paying 4%, right? Then what's going to happen is, intuition is, you're paying more than what you need, right, to issue debt. And then if you work out the NPV equation, what you're going to find out, this is very straightforward. Of course, before I came here, I checked with Antonio and Enrico, which courses you have taken, so I know that you've done some NPV before, right? And I know you can check this on your own, okay? So, in that case, if you work out the mathematical equation, you're going to find out that the NPV is negative. Okay? A negative NPV means that the company is losing value, right, by issuing debt, which is because you're paying more than what you need, right? Okay? So now let's talk about the NPV of equity. Equity is a little bit trickier, okay, because it's going to force us to think, you're thinking in terms of dividends, right? Turns out that dividends is not right. So it's not really the cost, right? The cost is issuing shares. So we have to think about how are we going to calculate the NPV of equity, right? So again, the benefit, right, in the NPV formula you have the cash inflow and the cash outflows, right? So the benefit is the cash coming in, right? And the cost is not the dividend, right? So the cost is issuing new shares. Okay? So, and here I'm giving you some additional data that we're going to need. I told you that the stock price of PepsiCo was $94. Okay? And you also have the market value of equity, right? And the number of shares, the total number of shares outstanding. And this is the real data for the company, but of course it is a fictitious example, right? So at that time, PepsiCo had a $1.5 billion shares outstanding. So that's why I said at the beginning, issuing 53 million new shares is not going to have a meaningful impact on control, right? Because the company has a lot of shares outstanding already. Okay? So we have to figure out, how we're going to, what's the NPV of equity, right? We're going to have an equation, but before we do the equation, what's going to be the answer? What do you think? What's the NPV of issuing equity? Huh? I heard. 0, right? Again, if markets are efficient, the NPV is going to be 0. If the market is, then we're going to think about the other cases too, but we have to get 0 at the end, somehow. Right? So how are we going to get 0? So to figure out the NPV of the equity issuance, we have to think in terms of stock price. Okay? So another general concept of corporate finance theory is that net present value and stock price are directly related. So maximizing net present value is equivalent to maximizing the stock price. So if we can estimate how the stock price of PepsiCo will change, that should give us the same direction. So if the stock price goes up, the NPV is positive. If the stock price goes down, the NPV negative, and vice versa. This is like a theoretical equivalent. Okay? So let's think about the stock price here in the bottom. Right? So the old stock price, right? Before PepsiCo issued shares, the stock price was $94. Okay? Of course, the stock price is equal to the market value of equity divided by the number of shares outstanding. Right? So you can check the math there. So here's what happens, right? The company is getting $5 billion from investors. That's cash, right? So the $5 billion is going to go to your market value, right? You know, you're richer, you have more cash, right? But then the number of shares outstanding goes up, right? And here I'm being very precise to make sure you get the same stock price, right? So, you know, that's the exact number of shares you need to issue to get $5 billion. If you do this calculation, you can check that you get exactly the same stock price. Okay? So the stock price doesn't change. Right? Again, it's the same notion as when we issue debt. The benefit, right, exactly compensates for the cost. Okay, so the NPV of equity is also zero. Right? And again, right, because the new cash coming in somehow exactly compensates for the issuance of new shares. Right? And that's why the stock price remains constant. Okay? So let's talk about a common argument that I always like to talk about in my it's very important to bring this up now, okay? Which is this notion of dilution, right? So if you ask people, you probably saw this already somewhere, right? So a common argument is that when you issue new equity, the stock price has to go down, right? And because the stock price is market value divided by shares outstanding. When you issue new equity, the number of shares goes up, so the stock price has to come down, right? Why is this argument wrong?
Because you're increasing your
value. Right? It's a very simple argument, okay? So dilution is not mechanical like that, okay? You're increasing the amount of cash coming in, right? There is a cost, but there is a benefit as well, right? So, it increases the market. It is true that issuing equity increases the number of shares, but the company receives cash in exchange, right? So, again, the key issue here is market efficiency. If equity is sold at a fair price, then the NPV should be zero. Okay, that's what we calculated. And this is what I like to tell the students, it's an easy thing to remember. Dilution is an illusion, okay? It seems that there's going to be dilution, but really, there is no dilution. If you issue stock price at the market, if you're issuing new shares at the market price, then there is no dilution. Okay? And of course, the same argument, remember what we did for the debt issuance, okay? The same argument works here as well. Right? Suppose that PepsiCo is issuing shares at a price of $90. Okay? Your market price was $94. You're issuing shares at $90. We're going to see that in practice, this is actually what's going to happen. When you issue shares, you end up issuing shares at a lower price. Okay? But we're going to do it in the cases later. For now, we're just doing this mechanical example, right? Suppose that PepsiCo issues shares at $90 when the market price is $94. Right? That doesn't look like a good deal, right? So you have a $94 price, you're issuing new shares at $90. That should give you a negative NPV. right? In our intuition, okay? So in terms of the math, what will happen, and you can check again to make sure you understand this calculation. The calculations are simple, but it's important to understand them, okay? What's going to happen is that the company, right, think about it. Now you're issuing shares at a lower price. So to get the same amount of cash, you're going to have to issue more shares, right? So now we're going to have like real dilution, right? Because the number of shares outstanding goes up too much, okay? And in that case, the NPV of the equity issuance is negative, okay? And then the same thing happens if the company somehow can issue shares at a price higher than the market, then you're basically fooling investors, right? And you're going to make money by issuing it. Okay? But that's really the basic notion. Okay? Any questions so far? Is that relatively clear? Good. And this is something people haven't asked yet, right? So let's go back to the beginning, right? PepsiCo is issuing securities to finance a new investment, right? That's the whole point, okay? Why, and I haven't talked, I computed the NPV of debt, equity, etc., without talking about the investment. Why are we doing it? Why can we do this? Let me see who has the right intuition. Why am I ignoring the net present value of the investment? Let's say it's like buying a machine or, like building a new factory, etc., right? Why am I ignoring the investment when I'm talking about debt and equity? Shouldn't that matter? Yeah, try to think about it. Of course, the answer is going to be there. Anyone? Right, so we're thinking about should we issue debt or equity? Why can we ignore the investment?
Because it doesn't affect debt and equity. It's an operational...
Yeah, that's the right intuition. It has to do with the operations, right? So it's not really a financial decision. But we're issuing debt to invest, right? So the two are linked. It's almost that, but let me give you another. Anybody else? Okay, here's the answer. It has to do with this notion of incremental, right? So in simple words, the reason we can ignore it is because the NPV of the investment is the same, irrespective of whether you issue debt and equity. Okay? Think about, you're going to invest the money anyway. The factor is the same. Right? So when you calculate NPV, it's only the incremental cash flows that matter, right? So if if your sales go up, that affects NPV. If the sales is the same, then that's not going to affect NPV. Okay? So here is the same. One way to think about it, right, is using these equations. Okay? So of course, you're issuing debt to finance an investment, right? So if you want to include the NPV of investment in the NPV of debt, that's fine, okay? But then you have to include the NPV of investment in the equity equation as well, right? Because you're going to issue equity to finance the investment. And of course, the NPV of the investment is the same in both equations, so, it's going to disappear, right? Whatever the NPV of the investment is, which we hope is positive, is not going to affect the debt or equity decision in this case. Okay? So that's a very important principle of corporate finance as well, right? And this is what you might think this is related to your comment about operational, right? So we can kind of separate operational and financial decisions, even though they're linked, right? Of course, you're issuing debt to finance an investment. But that's the reason why we can separate. Whatever way you finance the investment, the NPV of the investment is the same. Okay? Or even if we're using cash, right? Suppose PepsiCo was using, its own cash. Okay? The same thing applies. Okay? So the NPV of the investment doesn't matter. We're not going to be talking about, we're going to give a lot of financial examples of financial decisions. And of course, there is an underlying investment, so I'm always going to, in the cases, etc., I'm going to tell you why is the company doing what it's doing. But the NPV of the investment is never going to, we never have to think about the operational side in order to talk about corporate finance. Okay, corporate financial, purely financial district. Okay, and remember this zero NPV concept, right? Is actually very general in corporate finance. Like I said, it's the same thing as market efficiency. So if markets are efficient, the NPV of any purely financial activity should be zero. Right? For example, dividends, we talked about equity issuance, but the NPV of paying more dividends should also be zero. Right? We're going to talk about that when we do payout. Okay? Or the net present value of doing a stock buyback, which is something we're going to talk about also when we do payout, that should also be zero. Okay? Or issuing more complex securities, right? So what about issuing a convertible bond? I think you talked about Professor Salver's convertible bond. That should also be zero, right? Somehow, we have to come to zero because zero is market efficient, right? Or risk management, right? We're going to talk about risk management as well. You can go in the futures exchange and buy an oil future, for example. The NPV should be zero. Okay? It's a very important concept to have in your brain. And I understand it's a theoretical concept, but what it does, it helps us focus on, the right trade-offs. Right? Of course, there are arguments and there are theories that and evidence on what firms doing in practice and arguments for why you do that or equity, etc. But the zero NPV is a starting point. Okay, I know you talked with Antonio about the Modigliani and Miller result, right? This is related. Okay, zero NPV is a related concept, right? So when Modigliani and Miller means that you really don't care about which security you issue, zero NPV means you don't care as well, right? So it's kind of a related concept. Okay? So this is something we're going to be using, and there is a very powerful economic argument, right? If you're thinking, I'm making up stories here. I think it's very easy to convince yourself that zero NPV is powerful because it's kind of a market equilibrium. Okay? So let me give you an example. Suppose that the NPV of investing in a PepsiCo bond was positive. So investors are making money by lending money to Pepsi, right? So the NPV is positive for investors. It means that it's negative for PepsiCo, right? Someone is making money, someone is losing money. What's going to happen in the market? So investors are making money by lending money to PepsiCo. What's going to happen? Yeah, right. The price is going to go up. Okay, this is basic economics. This is good. It's good. Everybody wants it. Oh, I want to lend money to PepsiCo too, right? What's going to happen is the price goes up, right? The price of what? The price of the bond goes up, right? So, if the price of the bond goes up, investors are paying more, right? And the price is going to go up until the NPV becomes zero, right? Suppose the price goes up too much, then the NPV becomes negative, and then, oh, no, this is bad, I'm going to stop lending money to pay. Okay? So zero NPV is also related to a very basic notion of market equilibrium. Right? So that's why it's such a powerful concept. Okay? Any question on this? Yes.
I want to ask that the NPV of debt and equity when doing investment, why is all increasing, not only one part? Because I'm issuing debt to invest, but there's no change in any equity problem. I didn't.
So when you issue equity, right, the company is going to take the $5 billion.
Yeah.
And what are you going to do with it?
Invest and issue.
Yeah. So and then the NPV of the investment is also the equation of the NPV of equity. It's the same NPV, whatever it is. Suppose it's $500 million. Okay? So the NPV of that is 0 because of the calculation we did, plus 500 million.
Yeah.
The NPV of equity is 0 plus 500 million.
Why
So-
is this part? Like, why is also equity is increasing? Why?
Well, because you're investing the money, right?
Yeah.
It's the same, you're doing exactly the same thing that you were doing when you're issuing debt. You're taking the cash and building the factory.
It's not that I only choose one of them, or I didn't do both.
Yeah, no, well, yeah, exactly. So you're using the NPV concept to decide which one you do, right? So as we said in the before, you're going to issue debt if the NPV of debt is bigger than the NPV of equity, right? You're going to issue equity if the NPV of equity is bigger than the NPV of debt.
Yeah.
But what this means is the NPV of the investment cancels out, right? So, you know, if you deduct 500 million, you know, the $500 million is going to be on both equations. So when you do NPV of debt minus NPV of equity, it cancels out. Okay? Unless somehow you're building a different factory, right? If you issue debt or equity, but that's not, right? That's not reasonable, right? I mean, you're doing the same investment. So it's not incremental. Okay? Any other question on this? So market efficiency means zero NPV, right? But this is theory. Okay, so now, before we actually do some cases, I also want to talk a little bit about the empirical, you know, what happens in the real world, right? You know, this, of course, we study this in corporate finance, and it's not true that debt and equity are exactly equivalent, right? So, and you might have talked about some of these issues with Professor Salvi, but I think it's good to recap because I really need this to go deeper into this topic. So what we're going to do is talk a little bit about research, right? So as you know, we do research, we do teach corporate finance, we also do research, right? So let's talk a little bit about research. Okay? So, right, so we just learned this concept that issuing debt or equity should generate a zero NPV, right? And, we also know that NPV and stock prices are very related, right? So zero NPV means that there is no change in stock price, right? And vice versa. If stock prices don't change, it means the NPV is zero. But that gives us a very nice way to actually see what happens in the real world, right? Because think about it, stock prices, if it's a public company, oh, and by the way, I was going to say this in the beginning, of course, all my examples are going to be for U.S. companies, okay? Just because of the material I have. You know, I wish I had more international examples, but it's all going to be U.S. data, okay? Which, you know, most of the research in corporate finance does use U.S. data, but it's nice to have other examples, right? But anyway, so using U.S. data, I'm going to show you the U.S. evidence here, even though international evidence is not very, very different. What we can do is we can look at stock prices, right? If a company is public, right? And we know when companies are issuing debt and equity, what researchers can do is they can measure what happens to stock prices when companies issue debt and equity, right? And that's what we call in finance, it's not only corporate finance, people also use this in investments, etc. This is what we call an event study, right? In an event study, what we do is we examine the market's reaction to new information immediately after the market learns the new information. So to do an event study properly, you have to figure out what's the day at which the market learned this, which sometimes can be tricky because there is, leakage of information. Investors might find out, for example, if there is a merger and acquisitions deal, you have to figure out exactly when the market first learned that the companies were considering this deal. Otherwise, you can't do a proper event. Okay? And there is an old paper that, 95 now is relatively old, right? that summarizes the evidence on event studies on capital structure. But nothing really has changed much over the years. This is very robust evidence. Okay? So if there are papers updating this classic one, but nothing has changed much. So this is what happens in the data. Okay? If there is debt issuance, so for example, you can do an event study using bonds, right? A bond issuance causes a non-reaction, right? I wrote that earlier. It does cause a non-reaction. It does not cause a reaction, okay? So, when companies issue bonds, on average, there is no change in stock price. So that's zero NPV. That's what we learned. It seems that, zero NPV also works in the real world. But here's the problem, right? And you might know this from practice, or you talked about this with Salvi, I don't know, but issuing new equity does cause the stock prices to decline. Okay? So when companies issue equity, on average, stock prices decline by 1.5% to 3%. Okay? So now we have, right, using what we learned already, and that's part of the reason why I go through those mechanical examples, right? Now we know that issuing equity somehow is negative NPV, right? On average, investors see, equity issuance as a negative NPV action because it's causing the stock prices to go down, right? Okay? And like I said, this is one of the pieces of evidence that I think is very useful for anybody to know, any students or practitioners, because this is very robust evidence over the years in corporate finance. Okay? Using US data, but as I said, the evidence for other countries is not that different. As far as I know, international evidence on event studies of capital structure tends to give you the same results. Okay? So now let's go back to our original question, right? So stock prices tend to go down when companies issue equity. Okay? Issuing equity is negative NPV. So how would companies then finance investments in the real world? What would you predict? Would companies prefer to issue debt or equity?
No.
Debt. Right? Which turns out that, it is also consistent with empirical evidence. Okay? Again, this is for the United States, but it's not that different for other countries. Okay? What this is some data that I put together from the Federal Reserve System. So this is looking at the entire US economy. Okay? And what these bars that you see there are the total amount of equity issuance and debt issuance by US companies divided by investments. Okay, so there is a definition of new investment in the flow of funds in aggregate data. So what you can do is you can divide, for example, the red bars are the net amount of debt issued by US companies divided by total investment. And you can see that the red bars are positive for most years, right? Except 2009, that's right after the financial crisis. So what happened there is companies were trying to reduce debt. Okay? But except for 2009, you see all the red bars are positive and relatively significant, right? So it's 20%, 30%, So companies issue a lot of debt to finance investment. Okay? The equity issuance bars are the green ones, and what you can see there is they are all negative, right? So how can equity issuance be negative? What are we talking about here?
Buyback shares?
Buyback, exactly. Okay? On average, in the US economy, companies are spending money to buy back shares rather than issuing new shares. Okay? Why are they doing it? Of course, there are underlying reasons, but it has to do with the stock price evidence we talked about, right? Companies know that the market reacts positively when you buy back shares and you react negatively when you issue shares. So if you look at the entire economy, what you see is companies are not really issuing equity to finance investment, right? All the green bars are negative. And then, of course, the most important source of funds is internal funds, right? So companies, as we said in the beginning, PepsiCo could have financed the investment by using its own cash holdings or the cash flows, right? And this is what companies do. You probably saw that with Professor Salvi, right? That's part of what we call the pecking order, right? So companies prefer to use internal funds to finance investment. But if you focus on the debt versus equity question that we started with, right? The answer for the economy is here. Debt issuance is important, equity issuance is not. Okay? So, the pecking order, right? So companies are reluctant to issue equity in practice, right? This is what I was talking about using the, okay? So why is it I'm not, I believe you covered, I saw the syllables of what Antonio talked about, right? This has to do with this notion of asymmetric information, right? Why is the NPV negative, okay? And, one of the most the argument that finance academics believe that best explains this evidence is that the managers know more about the company than the market does, right? So when a company sells equity, when you issue new equity, right, the market kind of interprets that signal as a signal that the current stock price is too high, right? It sends a negative, you're willing to sell shares, right? The market interprets that as a signal that the stock price is too high, so the price goes down. It's not really a violation of market efficiency, right? Because you're bringing in this asymmetric information. Okay? So that is the theory, but we're not going to have to go into that a lot. So what I like to focus on is that, so on average what we learned is companies don't like issuing equity, but there are very important exceptions, right? So the interesting thing is actually talking about the exceptions, which is what we're going to do here, right? The exceptions are venture capital, okay? Venture capital is mostly equity financed, and we're going to talk about why when we talk about venture capital. When companies do IPOs, they're also issuing equity, like the initial public offering was the first time that companies issue shares in the market. And then the other major exception comes from the mergers and acquisitions market. As I was saying in the beginning, mergers and acquisitions is a very good laboratory to study financial decisions, and we're going to learn why. Okay? M&A turns out to be an exception as well. There is a lot of equity issued in large M&A deals. Okay, and we're going to have a case study where we're going to cover that. Okay, these are important exceptions, right? But they are relatively small, and that's why when you look at the economy as a whole, right? The equity issuance that goes, venture capital industry, for example, is very important, but is relatively small compared to the size of the U.S. economy, right? So it doesn't really overturn that basic pattern, but these are very important exceptions. So it's very interesting for us to try to understand why is it that companies are issuing equity in this situation. Okay? So I hope this is something we're going to be able to cover. But really the key takeaway is that in a corporate finance class you really have to understand debt financing very well, right? Because debt is the most important source of external funds for most companies, right? Because of the evidence, that we saw. When companies finance new investments and you can't finance it with your own internal funds, then issuing debt, right, is the go-to option, right? And so what I like to do, in my corporate finance classes is to really go into a lot of detail about debt financing. Right, so that's what we're going to do next. We're going to talk about details about pricing, collateral, credit ratings, all the all the aspects of that financing that matter in the real world and that allow you to understand this. Okay? So before we do that though, any question on this part, by the way? Any question here? I was told, well, I mean, it's going to be good for us to have a break, right? But like an hour and 15 is okay, right? When do people take
When you prefer, Professor.
Huh?
When you prefer.
We can be democratic here. I'm not a
Yeah.
dictator. So let's do, we'll do like an hour and 15, an hour and 20, or if there is a natural breaking point, what I like them to do is when I'm going to stop in the middle of something, right? We'll stop in the, and then we'll do a 10-minute break. That's what people do. 15? Yeah, 15 minutes. Okay, good. 30 minutes. Okay, 15. Any question on this? Yeah, this talking. So, this is another topic you studied with Antonio, I think, the trade-off model of capital structure. But I want to do a recap because it's going to be very important for us, especially in the real world. When we do cases, right? I'm going to be using the trade-off model very heavily, and so I want to make sure that we are that you remember this. Okay? So, and then we're going to be able to go into the details of that time. So. So let's go back to the PepsiCo example, okay? So, like PepsiCo was issuing $5 billion in debt, okay? How is the issuance going to impact the company's profit? What tends to be your answer when you think about this? Or you're issuing debt, what's going to happen to your profit?
Decrease.
Down, right? Turns out this is wrong, okay? Issuing debt is going to increase profits. And that we're going to see why. Okay? So, right, and that's how I see the trade-off. Okay? So this is the decrease that we saw, right? So interest payments are going up by $200 million, right? So your net income, your earnings go down, right? So shareholders have lower profit. Okay? So this is the income statement, right? That I said before. Before and after, right? So interest payments go up by $200 million, your earnings are going down. Okay? So, this is a question, right? It seems like a trivial question, right? But that's really where the trade-off is going to come in. So, is PepsiCo more or less profitable after the debt issuance? Well, I just said that less profitable is the wrong answer, right? So it has to be more. Okay? So let's try to understand why. Let me actually ask you this. What's the benefit of issuing debt? In the trade-off model. You remember that? Taxes, right? So issuing debt is going to reduce taxes. Okay? And it is actually there. This is a real income statement, so the tax effect is in the income statement. Okay? So if you look here, income before taxes is changing, okay? And really what's happening is that, let me actually do this in the income statement. You have to be careful about how you measure business, how you measure profits. That's the problem, okay? It turns out that you cannot think of earnings as profits. That's not the right concept. That's what gets into trouble here. Okay? So net income is profit to the shareholder. Right? But really what you need here is a notion of profits that captures profits to the company. Okay? So you can't look at the bottom of the income statement. You're gonna have to have a measure of profits that measures business profits. Okay? So because of the tax effect, what's going to happen is that the profits to the whole business are going to go up, right? Despite the fact that shareholders have lower profit, the profits for the business are going to go up. what I like to do, to use, I mean, there are different measures you can use here, but I like to use what we call OPAT. Okay? This is operating profits after tax, right? I mean, in the trade-off model, you need to use a measure of business profit that is after tax to capture the tax benefit. Okay? So operating profit after tax, and operating profit after tax is measured using EBIT. Okay, so EBIT is operating income. If you remember your accounting, that's on the top of the income statement before you deduct interest payment. Okay, so the interest payments don't count here in this measure of business profits. You're not. This is before interest, right? But you are deducting taxes, right? So what's going to happen when a company issues debt? What's going to happen to that measure? EBIT is before interest, so EBIT doesn't change, right? What happens to taxes? Decrease, so that means your profits are going up. Okay? So that's a very simple way to think about the trade-off model, is that, you know, the benefit of that in the trade-off model is that it increases your profitability. Okay? So if we go back to the PepsiCo example, right, and you can do the accounting here, right? So we have the EBIT up there, right? EBIT is operating income, so you can think of that as sales minus cost, basically, right? It's a basic measure of profit to the whole business, right? So for example, in 2015, EBIT was $9.647 billion, right? Then the PepsiCo increased interest expenses, right? What happened is taxable income went down, taxes went down. If you use the measure of profit that I call OPAT, what you see is that profits actually increase. Okay? So the profits are going up after the debt issue. Okay? And what's going on is that, you know, you're taking money away from the government. Right? So the government is getting less because debt is tax deductible. Okay? There's lower taxable income. The company is taking money away from the government. So in a picture, we're going to use some pictures to talk about the trade-off model. That's a way to think about leverage. Is the more leverage a company has, the more profitable the company is going to be. Okay? So OPAT increases with leverage. So you're more profitable as leverage goes up. Okay? But then, you know, there is a point that the trade-off model is going to kick in, right? I mean, you can keep doing this, right? So suppose that that PepsiCo decides to issue so much debt that the interest expense becomes the same as EBIT. So now you're paying $9.6 billion in interest. What's the problem? Why would this be a bad idea? Suppose your interest expense, I mean, now you're paying zero taxes, right? Isn't that good? No, what's the problem? What's the other side of the trade-off model? Distress, right? So now what's happening is the company is becoming financially distressed. I mean, you're barely able to pay your interest. You're using all, right? You're using all the profits that you have to pay interest. Okay? And that's the other side. Right? The company is very close to not being able to repay debt. Okay? So, you know, any small shock is going to cause the company is probably going to go bankrupt in that case. And even before becoming bankrupt, as you talked with, probably learned with Professor Salvi, financial distress can reduce further, right? So, and you know, this is, for example, let's think about the situation here, where, so it doesn't have to be PepsiCo, this can be any example, right? So, suppose that a company has a situation like that. So, your operating income is $1.9 billion, and your interest payment has become larger than your operating income. Okay? So you have to pay $1.9 billion in interest, and you don't have sufficient profits, right? What's going to happen? How should a company respond to this? What type of actions can the company take in this case?
Issue equity.
Yeah, right? You're going to have to raise cash. You're going to have to change something. Right? Issue equity is one option. What else? How can you raise cash?
Pay less dividend.
Yeah, you're cutting dividends, right? In an extreme case, you can even cut investments. You're going to have to fire people, right? So those are what we call the costs of financial distress, right? I mean, if you have cash, you're going to spend cash. You can try to refinance that, right? Or issue equity, cut dividends. The point is that all of these options are likely to generate costs. So, for example, we learned that when companies issue equity, the NPV is that the market reacts negatively, right? That's going to be a cost. Cutting investments and firing people, can be costly as well. Cutting dividends, as we're going to learn, is costly. I mean, all of these options are costly, so that's what we call the cost of financial distress. And again, we can bring research here to talk about how large are these costs of distress. We have some empirical evidence in finance research. That's a paper, that's a very famous paper, estimating how much value companies lose once they enter financial distress. And it can be very significant. It's 10% to 25% of firm value measured 1 year prior to distress. So, these are large percentages, right? And of course, these costs affect capital structure decisions, as you learn, right? So now we have two things, okay? Now we have the profitability, but we also have the distress costs, right? So as leverage goes up, the risk of financial distress increases, right? And that reduces the value of the company. Okay, so the profit, the company is becoming more profitable because you're paying less taxes, but the risk of financial distress is going up, right? And those are the two components, right? You probably saw a picture like that, with the professor's salary. There is a trade-off, right? So for a company should, in principle, have an optimal leverage ratio. That's where your value is maximized, right? So that's where you get the maximum benefit of the tax benefits when compared to the cost of financial distress. So that's what we call the L star here in this picture is the optimal leverage ratio. Okay? So that's the trade-off model that we're going to be using, and it turns out that we actually have some new evidence in corporate finance. So this is, of course, one of the topics that people research the most. And I can actually show you, I don't know if Professor Salvi did this, but I can actually show you how this figure looks like on average for the US economy based on some recent research. Okay? So there is a paper by a research paper by a professor called Arthur Korteweg, and what he did in that paper is he estimated the effect of leverage on the cost of capital for firms of different characteristics. This is again using US data, right, and it's using public firms, so it's limited to that context, but it's going to be useful for us anyway. And it's important, and when I show you this picture, okay, it's very important to use a specific measure of leverage. That you're going to see in the example that we're going to do later how we calculate this, but the measure of leverage that we have to use in this calibrated version of the trade-off model is this one. Okay, so it's the total debt divided by debt plus the market value of equity. Okay, so it's the market capitalization. You cannot use the book value, otherwise the picture is going to look different. Okay, so this has to be done. This picture has to be interpreted with that caveat. This is the market value of equity. Okay, and we can do this because this is based on public firm. Okay, so this is how the picture looks like for a median US firm, and you're going to see in the many cases that this picture is actually very useful to think about specific real world cases, because you can kind of see when leverage is getting too high. Okay? So what we know from research is that if you start from zero, okay, zero leverage, so the company has no debt at all, right? Starting from zero debt, if you move to 30%, right? So increasing leverage up to 30% of your total value increases business value by 5%. Okay? So you get a 5% increase until you get to the optimal, and then it starts going down. And the other thing that we know from the US evidence is that the optimal is very close to the observed. So the median US firm actually has leverage that is close to 30%. So 30, you can think of this 30% is an important number to have in the back of your mind. Of course, it's mostly useful for US cases, right? The ones that I'm going to do here. So when you're looking at US public firms, this 30% is a good number to have in mind. That's, according to recent research, that's where your value is maximized. Okay? And once you start moving to leverage ratios that are above 30%, then the cost of financial distress becomes more important than the tax payment. Okay? So that is the optimal, and you're going to see in the cases exactly how we use this. But this is, and of course this is for a medium firm, right? So of course firms of different characteristics might have different leverage ratios, etc. But this picture is fairly useful, I think, to think about a case. Okay. So any question on this? Like I said, this is a recap, right? I know you covered the trade-off model already. I really wanted to show you this picture because I'm going to be using this in the cases, and it's kind of a quantitative version, right, of the picture you saw with Professor. Okay? It is actually a good time for us to do a break. Any question on this? Or you can ask here too, if you have this, you can come up here if you have individual questions.
70。
这是第二个山。
啊？
这是第二个山。
对，应该是。对对对对。
哇。
Sai cosa posso fare? E poi non lo so. Una domanda.
No, chiedimi.
Vero.
Ecco, invece che metterci le 40, ce ne metto 20.
Sì, sì, sì.
Ieri ci ho messo un'ora ad arrivare a casa.
Better.
Don't ask, okay.
Prima la metro sì.
Good.
Vabbè, la metro
I take the responsibility if someone... Who? No, I think only inside the building when you walk around.
perché ti metti solo la metro e poi fai
Also, Professor Salvi never wear the mask when in lesson. Oh, 3. So, I have the only one because I took COVID in March. Here, after the COVID, you have to do only one.
If you have the COVID infection, you only need one.
And maybe again in March, I do the second shot.
对，真的。过3天他不会就走了吧？
对，时差被能倒过来了，又回去。
Ho capito cosa fare. Oggi pomeriggio, però se mi viene a prendere mio papà resto fino alla fine, se no vado via alle
You can
4.
start. You can start.
Faccio così.
All right, so
12:30. Chi sta questo? Sì, se no
okay, so let's get started again. No, it sounds better without the mask, right? Mask and mic, very well. Yeah, thank you for saying I can teach without the mask. Okay, so one of the key takeaways that we learned already, right, in lecture 1 is that debt financing is the most important form of financing for companies, right? So as I mentioned there, it's very important then for us to understand some of the details of debt financing that are going to allow us to try to understand what type of debt companies issue and what happens when companies issue different types of debt. Okay, so the first important concept that we're going to talk about here is a notion of credit ratings. Okay, so credit ratings are very important in debt markets. It's a fundamental variable, really, right? And here, you have a map of the world with different credit ratings. Of course, these are the credit ratings of the different countries, right? So, every country has a credit rating for the debt that it issues in financial markets, and companies have credit ratings too. So this is an important variable for us to talk about. We use it a lot in corporate finance, right, to measure credit risk. This is a picture with the different ratings. These are the ratings that are issued by Standard & Poor's, right? It's one of the credit rating agencies. The other major one is Moody's. So you start with a AAA rating, right? That is investment, the highest investment grade rating. That's the rating that the U.S. U.S. and Germany have, for example, and then you go down. Of course, at some point you are in the junk rated category. So when you jump below BBB minus, you become junk rated. Okay, so there's different credit ratings. What we need to understand is what do they measure, right? And then we're going to see how we use them in corporate finance. So this is a sentence from a Standard & Poor's, right, talking about what credit ratings measure. So what they say is that the ratings express our opinion about the ability of an issuer, right? It can be a corporation, a state, a city government, to meet its financial obligations in full. Okay, so it's essentially a measure, right? Remember the trade-off model, right? You have the tax benefits of debt. You have the cost of financial distress, right? What the credit rating is a summary measure, right, of a company or a government chance, right, of meeting financial obligations, right? So if you have a very high credit rating, such as AAA, that means you have a very low probability of becoming distressed, etc., right? And if you have a low credit rating, then you are closer to bankruptcy. Okay, so that's basically what it is. The credit rating agencies are also very, they really emphasize the fact that they are not just, it's not just an objective model of a default probability, right? They also have subjective variables, it's basically their business, right? To how to produce this ratings, okay? And it's a measure, right, of the chance that an issuer defaults, okay? And they really emphasize the fact that it incorporates not only quantitative objective variables, but also judgment call and subjective variables, right? Otherwise, it would be more difficult for them to sell this. This is basically their business, right? And right, and we can, however, what you can do is we can back out the determinants, right? So we have credit ratings, and then we have the underlying corporate variables, right? We can back out which variables matter most for ratings. So this is a table that is very important for us to use in specific cases as well. Okay, you can look at leverage, right? As we I mentioned already in lecture 1, the measure of leverage that we like to use to think about credit risk is debt divided by market value of assets. Okay, so this is debt divided by, let me actually write it down there. So this is okay, so when I showed you that picture for the trade-off model, right, this is the definition of leverage that you should be thinking about. So market value of assets means the value of debt plus the market value of equity. Okay? So what you can see here is what are the typical credit ratings for different leverage ratios. So of course, the lower is your leverage ratio, the less likely it is that the issuer is going to default, right? So companies that, and this is for companies, by the way, okay? This is not for governments, etc. So companies that have a AAA credit rating, typically they have very low leverage. As you can see there, debt is only 3% of assets, right? And then leverage goes up as you move down the credit rating scale, okay? And then there is another measure that is an important determinant of credit ratings, which is the company's profitability, right? So when you think about this, it makes sense that irrespective of your leverage ratio, right? If a company is more profitable, it's less likely that you're going to have problems paying back your interest, right? So the other variable that is closely related to credit ratings is what we call the EBIT interest coverage. So it's essentially your operating income divided by interest payments. Okay? So as you can see here, companies that have very high ratings have very high interest coverage, and as we go down, the EBIT interest coverage decreases. So these variables are closely related to credit ratings, and as we're going to see in some cases, we can use this table to think about what should be the impact of a corporate financial decision on a company's credit rating. Okay? So highly levered companies have lower credit ratings, right? Particularly if they are less profitable. And then there are other variables that matter as well. We're going to emphasize, we're not going to need those as much. So size, for example, large companies controlling for leverage and profitability, large companies tend to have higher credit rating. So, and remember this idea that a company, right, or a country's credit rating can be taken as a summary measure of the risk of default. Okay? So, when you think about capital structure decisions in the real world, the financial managers, they typically target credit ratings. It's not only an optimal leverage ratio, but the credit rating also matters. And we're going to see the importance of credit ratings when we talk about, when I show you cases, you'll see how we can do this, but in the real world, financial managers tend to target credit ratings as well, not only an optimal target ratio. So for example, this is some evidence from just like some sentences from General Electric's 2006 annual report. For the General Electric, one of the company's strategic objectives is to maintain an AAA credit rating because it lowers the cost of funds, facilitates access to a variety of lenders, etc. So companies try to maintain certain credit ratings. Okay? So we're going to see how we use credit ratings here in a second. We know some data that we use to analyze debt issuance can be summarized by credit ratings. So credit ratings is an important variable, right, that for us when we think about debt issuance. It's also important for us to have a basic notion of how we price debt. So there's going to be a little bit of valuation here for us to think about how the pricing of debt is related to the chance of default. Okay, and we're going to have data on the chance of default for different credit ratings. So the question that we need to answer, right, has to do with the pricing of debt. So we're going to think about how banks and other lenders, such as bondholders, for example, right, have to determine interest rates on corporate debt, right? And for us to think about the relative cost of issuing bonds or issuing bank debt, for example, we need to understand how do banks and other lenders determine interest rates. Okay, and it turns out that the probability of default of a company is a very important determinant of the interest rate that the company pays on the debt security. Okay, so one way to see this is by comparing the U.S. government, right, with companies. So here, for example, you have this is data for 2016. These are the yields on or the promised returns on U.S. corporate bonds, right? As I said, I mentioned a few slides ago, the U.S. has a very high credit rating. Okay, so a 30-year U.S. bond at that point was promising a return. The yield to maturity on that bond was 2.4%. Okay, and then if you compare that to data on corporate bonds, so measured at the same time in 2016, right? So you can look at long-term. So we looked at the 30-year yield on a U.S. Treasury bond, right? So if you get data on a long-term yield on a corporate bond, at that same time it was 4.2%. Okay. So, right. So the long-term corporate yield was 4.22% at that time when I got this data. The U.S. government was paying a much lower yield. Okay. So what is the intuition here? Why is the yield to maturity on U.S. government bonds lower than the yield on corporate bonds? What's the basic difference? Why is it that the U.S. government can pay so much lower interest than an average company?
They have more ability to pay back.
Yes, right. So it has to do with what we're talking about. The U.S. government has much lower probability of default. Okay, so that's the intuition. We're actually going to see a very simple credit risk model where you can actually incorporate this idea. Okay, and the idea is that investors are going to demand a compensation, right, for the likelihood of default. So because companies default on the debt, then investors are going to demand a compensation for this. Okay? So the first thing we need to think about credit risk is we need to get some data on how large is the risk of default. And again, we have research in corporate finance that we can use to show this. Okay? So credit, all the data is given at the level of credit ratings. Remember that the credit rating, right, is the summary measure of the company's risk of default. Okay, so data on probability of default and other data for the debt securities tend to be given at the credit rating level. So that's why I like to start by reminding you what a credit rating is, because otherwise you wouldn't really understand this table, right? But what you see here is the average 10-year default probability for bonds of different credit ratings. So what this means is, you take a bond that is issued that has a rating of B. This is deep into the junk category, right? And so let's say we are in 2021, okay? What this probability means is in the next 10 years, almost half of these bonds are going to default. Okay, so the probability of default for bonds that are rated B is almost 50%. Okay, on the other hand, if you have a rating of AAA for the highest credit rating, you look in the next 10 years, there is almost no risk that the company is going to default. It's a very small probability. Okay, so these are objective measures of the risk of default, and you can see it for different credit ratings. Okay, so we're going to use this table a lot when we do real world cases. So this is what a bond this is what a bond looks like. So you have a 10-year. This is data for a 10-year bond for a U.S. company. This is for Monsanto. Okay. And here you have different data on the bond, including more complex variables that we're not going to need to talk about, like convexity, etc. So this bond has if you look here, I summarized the data, but this bond has a rating of BBB. Okay, so BBB is sort of the median rating for bonds in the U.S. And it's at that point I got this. This is in this data comes from 2016. It's a 10-year bond. Okay, so the bond was mature, meaning that the bond is maturing in April 15, 2025. Okay, and what this table shows you is the yield to maturity on the bond. Okay, so the yield to maturity, I hope you covered that on a previous class, but it's a very simple concept. That is the return that an investor will get from holding the bond if the bond does not default. Okay, so the yield to maturity on a 10-year BBB bond by Monsanto at that time was approximately 3%. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to think about credit risk. Okay, so how do we incorporate this notion of credit risk in our models here? So this is what's going on. Right, so suppose you are an investor, you invest in this bond today, right? The bond has a yield of 3%, that's an annual return, right? So in 1 year, there's two possible outcomes, right? So if the bond does not default, that happens with almost with 99.47% chance the bond does not default, the investor is going to get a return of 2.954%. That's the yield to maturity, right? That's, as I said before, the yield to maturity is the return that the investor gets if the bond does not default. Okay? But then, we saw the data, right? Monsanto has a rating of BBB, okay? And I gave you this data here, which allows us to approximate, to measure the probability of default for bonds of different credit ratings, right? So you have a probability of, the 10-year probability of default is 5.3%. So each year, right, there is a probability of default, you divide by 10, so it's 0.53%. So that's where I got that number from. Okay? So there is a 0.5% chance that Monsanto is going to default on the bond every year, and the investor is not going to get paid the promised return. Okay? So let's think about default now. what happens, and I don't know if you covered this in another class or not, but what happens when a company defaults? Is the investor going to get zero? So it depends, right? What happens in practice when a company defaults?
Pays debt first.
Yeah, right? So the debt holders have priority. Okay, so a very important variable is the priority of the security. So when a company defaults on the debt, when you cannot pay interest, the debt holders are essentially going to take over the company, right? And they're going to try to recover some of the value of the investment. And it turns out that we have data on that as well. That's what we call debt recovery. Okay, the recovery rate measures the payoff, right? What investors get when a company defaults on a debt security. And again, like I said, we have data on this. So using U.S. data, historically, investors have recovered for bonds. Investors who hold bonds have recovered 40% of face value on average. Okay? Because they can liquidate assets, for example, whatever is left in the company, like real estate, even if the company has no profits anymore, there's going to be some value left over that investors recover. So the return is not minus 100%, right? The investor doesn't lose everything, right? But you're losing 60% of your investment because you only recover 40%. Right? So for example, if you hold $1 million of investment in the company, you're only recovering $400,000, right? So that means you have a return of minus 60%. Okay? So what we can do now is we can calculate what is the expected return, right? So if an investor is holding this Monsanto bond, okay, you have you have a very big chance you're going to get paid back, but there is a chance that each year the company is going to default, right? What we can do is we can calculate the expected return, right? And you probably, so how do we calculate expected returns here? Let me see if you remember this from. Yeah, right? So it's a simple weighted average, okay? So there is two possibilities, right? And to calculate the expected return, all you need to do is to do a weighted average, right? So even though, and what you can see here is that even though the probability of default is very small, right? Because the investor loses so much, right? You have such a negative return. That's even with the recovery, right? You have such a negative return when the bond defaults that the expected return is significantly lower, right, than the yield to maturity. Okay? So this is an important concept that we're going to use to think about different types of debt securities, including preferred equity and bank debt, etc. That the expected return on a debt security, that's true for any debt security, not only bonds. Okay? It's true for bonds in particular. The bond's expected return is always lower than the yield to maturity. Okay, so the data that you get on the bonds from the market is going to be the yield to maturity, but the yield to maturity is not the expected return. The expected return is always lower because, if the bond defaults, the investor is not going to get that. And you can use, this I'm calling this a credit risk model. Of course, this is a very simple credit risk model. If you take a class on fixed income, for example, you're going to see a lot more complicated credit risk models, but this is for our purpose in corporate finance to think about different types of debt securities. This is enough. Okay, so this very simple weighted average here is going to allow us to cover the main concepts that we need. Okay, but remember this, that the yield to maturity is not really the expected return. Okay. And this is a powerful concept. We can use this to see what changes. For example, suppose now that we're going to change the risk of default. Okay, so we have now we have a company that is very similar. Let's say it's very similar to Monsanto. Let's say we have a perfect comparable, but the company has lower leverage. So it's going to have a higher credit rating. Okay? We can use that simple credit risk model to figure out how should the yield to maturity change. Okay? So now, what's happening? Our bond is rated A, right? So A is a higher credit rating. If you go back to the table here, right, let me show you this again, right? Remember, we have this estimated probabilities of default for bonds of different credit ratings. We can use this data again, okay? So that's how I got that number, 0.1.63. The annual probability of default for a bond that is rated A is slightly lower, right, than the probability of default for Monsanto because the rating is higher. Okay? So what's going to happen? What does your intuition tell you? What's going to happen to the yield to maturity? It should go up or down? Right? So the risk of default decreased, right? So somehow the yield to maturity has to go down. Okay? And we can actually use this credit risk model to figure that out. Okay? So for the BBB bond, we had a yield to maturity of 2.954%, right? The expected return was 2.62. Okay? So what's going to happen for the A bond? Right? Our intuition is telling us that the yield to maturity should decrease. Okay? One way to do this calculation is to assume, you can assume first that the expected return is the same. Okay, so you can make the assumption that the investor who invests in these bonds demands an expected return of at least 2.62%. Okay, so if I'm going to invest in a bond of higher credit risk, I want the compensation so that I get the same expected return. Okay, so if you assume that the expected return is the same, later on in the case we're going to talk about that. The expected return can also change a bit with the credit risk. But if you assume that the expected return is the same, okay, which is a reasonable assumption to start with, you can use that model to figure out quantitatively what happens to the yield to maturity. Okay, so now we have the expected return, right? And we have the possible outcomes, right? Now we can use the weighted average equation, not to calculate. Now we're not calculating, the 2.62% is given, right? You can use this equation now to back out what the yield to maturity should be in order to get exactly 2.62%. Okay? So you can do this, manually in algebra, or you can do this in Excel. What I like to do is just to set up a simple Excel spreadsheet where I just do it by trial and error, so I don't have to do calculations. Okay? But it's very simple algebra here, right? Okay? So the yield to maturity is decreasing, right? Remember it was 2.94%, 2.95. Now it's going down a bit because here's the data. Okay, our investor knows that the probability of default of the A bond is lower, right? So you can get the same expected return with a lower yield to maturity. Okay, so that's what this calculation is telling us. Right, so a very important determinant of the yield to maturity is the probability of default of different bonds. Okay, everybody understood this? Any question on this calculation? You know how to do that? That is right? Okay, good. Right, so the bottom line is because investors demand a compensation for the default, companies are going to pay higher interest rates as credit risk increases. Okay, so this is one of the theories we're going to use when we talk about the real world cases. Okay, and we're also going to use the recovery rate. It turns out that a very important determinant of the yield to maturity is how much the investors get back if the company cannot pay. And the intuition here is simple, right? The higher recovery rate is going to lower. So if suppose the investor gets back more money, right? If the recovery rate goes up, then the investor can demand a lower yield to maturity, right? You have the same risk of default, but the losses upon default are going to be smaller. Okay, and we're going to learn that this insight is actually going to help us understand the company's debt structure. So what type of debt the company is going to issue is going to be a function of the recovery rate of debt. Okay, so which is actually where we're going next. But this is the most important point of this part of the lecture is really to emphasize that there is this direct link between the yield to maturity and the compensation for default that we can actually, get a hand on it. We can actually calculate approximately what it would be for different different real world cases. And we're going to see how we can use the same model to think about recovery rates. Okay? Any question on this so far? Any question on this part? Okay. So now we're going to try to think about different types of debt, right? So in the real world, companies don't issue only bonds, right? There's different types of debt. And for example, we can get data for Monsanto. That's the company that we're analyzing here. They have if you look at the companies, this is not really this. Data don't really come from the standard financial statement. When companies report total debt in the balance sheet, they don't have to tell investors which types of debt they are. So to get this data, you have to go to the company's annual report. Okay? But in the annual report, it will be available. And I get this data from a data source called Capital IQ, which has details on the company's debt structure. So you can see here that Monsanto has different types of debt. So the number you would get in the balance sheet is the total debt outstanding, which is $10.5 billion, right? But here what this table is showing you is what different characteristics of this debt. So for example, $1.9 billion are what's called commercial paper, right? And then there's term loans, revolving credit, senior bonds. Most of the debt that Monsanto issues is actually bonds. So it's the most common type of debt issued by that company. And then you have other data as well. Here, I'm going to emphasize the collateral. So this data also tells you if the debt is secured or not. So of course, secure debt means that the debt is going to be secured by collateral. It can be assets, real estate. Okay, unsecured debt is just secured by cash flows. So the company pays out of cash flows. Right? So we're going to talk about all these different types of debt. I think by the end of the class you're going to be more comfortable understanding all these different types of debt. So the idea is that debt has many phases. Okay? So let's talk about the different types of debt here for a second. So commercial paper, right? In the case of Monsanto, 18.3% of Monsanto's debt is commercial paper. So what is commercial paper? You can think of commercial paper basically as a short-term bond. Okay? So it's a type of debt that is sold directly to the market. So there is no intermediary like a bank, or you don't have a lender. Commercial paper is sold to investors in the market. But it's very short term, so it's typically less than 270 days. And when you look at the data, what you see is that commercial paper is really only a relevant source. You have to go? Okay.
1 hour and we come back.
All right, great. So commercial paper is only relevant for firms that have very high credit ratings. Okay? So it's only companies that have very high credit ratings, only companies that have very high credit ratings are able to issue commercial paper in the market. Okay? And it has to be BBB or higher. Junk, you're not going to see junk companies issuing commercial paper because they basically don't have access to that market. So when you look at the aggregate data, you have 176 billion of outstanding of a commercial paper issued by U.S. company. Okay? Then you have revolving credit on that table. Revolving credit is a bank loan that originates from a drawdown of a credit line, right? So companies can have a credit line with a bank. We're going to talk a lot about credit lines also when we talk about liquidity management. So Monsanto, if you look at the data here, let me show you the table again. When you look at the data, Monsanto has an undrawn credit line, okay, of $1 billion. That means that the company has not borrowed, right? Has not really issued any loans from that credit line. And when you look at revolving credit is going to capture, if the company borrows money using that credit line, then it goes to revolving credit. Okay? So you can see that revolving credit is zero. Right? So the company has an undrawn credit line, but revolving credit is zero. So why is this going on? Why would the company have a credit line if it's not using it?
Maybe future.
Yeah, the future, right? So we're actually going to see as our last case study, we're going to see that credit lines have a very important insurance role. In fact, it's what happened in corporate finance last year during COVID-19. Is a lot of companies were unable to issue bonds. For example, they had to go to the credit lines to issue them. Okay, so basically the credit line is going to be used if Monsanto has trouble refinancing existing liabilities, such as accounts payable or commercial paper. Okay, and then you have term loans. If you go back to that table, term loans are basic bank loans. Okay, this can be short term or can be long term. If you look at Monsanto, it's a very small fraction. So Monsanto in particular uses mostly bonds to finance to issue debt. It's 80% of the total amount, plus the commercial paper, which, as we saw, you can think of commercial paper as a short-term bond, right? And it's a very small fraction from bank loans. Okay, and we're going to, part of what we're going to try to understand is what determines this. Why is Monsanto using using bonds, and why would other companies use bank loans? We're going to get to that. Okay, and then you have capital leases. So leases are it basically comes from rentals. So rather than borrowing money from investors to buy equipment, the other way that companies can do this is to rent the equipment. Okay, so you can rent the equipment, and this, of course, a rental generates a liability. It's the rental payment. Okay, and the capital lease that you see in balance sheets in the U.S., this is a lease that cannot be canceled by the company before the contract expires. It's not important for Monsanto. When you look at the data, leases are only used for certain industries. For example, airlines. It's very common to see leases for airlines. Here is the debt structure for JetBlue, the airline in the U.S. You can see that for JetBlue, capital leases are more important. They have almost 10% of their total debt in capital leases. Of course, what's happening here is they're leasing airplanes, right? But leases are not important for Monsanto. The most important sources then of debt financing are banks and bonds. Okay, when you look at the aggregate data in the U.S., you have $4.8 trillion of outstanding bonds, right? Just compare that to the commercial paper, for example, right? It's a lot more. And then you have $2.6 trillion of outstanding loans. This includes revolving credit. Okay, so this data it's for the end of 2015, so relatively recent. So when you think about companies' debt structure, right? Okay, there's all these different types of debt, but the most important question is how do companies choose between bonds and bank debt, right? I don't know if you're wondering, but Monsanto has bonds, and then we're going to see example of other companies that are issuing bank debt. What determines this? Okay, so this is the most important question of debt. When you think about different types of debt, this is the central question because those really are the most important types of debt security, and we're going to see that our, that simple credit risk model that we talked about is going to help us understand this. Okay, and coupled with the trade-off model of capital structure, we're going to be able to understand this. Okay, so let me give you an example of a company that uses of the type of company that uses bank loans. Okay, actually, before I do this, let me ask you. So if you look at the data, what's going to happen? For example, for the U.S., which types of firms are going to be using bank loans instead of bonds? Let me see if you can give me an example here. What are going to be some of the variables that are going to determine this? Or any country really, but here we're going to use US data, right? What types of firms are going to use bank loans instead of bonds?
Supermarket.
Huh?
Supermarkets.
Supermarket? No, yes. Right. So it could be industries, right? Because we're thinking about industries. Okay? Let's think about firm characteristics first. What type of company is going to be using bonds? Bank loans instead of bonds. We just saw an example of a company that uses bonds, right?
The ones that are not listed.
Yes, right. So companies that are not listed, that would be a good example, right? If you're not listed, it's going to be more difficult for you to issue a bond. You can still issue a bond, so you can have companies that don't have stock prices, that don't have equity listed, but that issue bonds. But that's going to be an example. What else? When you look in the size distribution, for example, what's going to happen? Large and small.
Small loans.
Smaller companies are going to be relying more on loans, right? And which is something that I think people, anybody who has an interest in finance probably knows this, right? But now we can actually understand, I think, why this is the case. And the other variable we're going to see is this choice has to do with the credit risk as well. So we're going to use our credit risk model to talk about this choice. But here's an example. You have two companies in the same industry. This is a Home Depot. It's a large, I don't know if you know, of course, you don't live in the US, so Home Depot is basically construction equipment for homes, so people go there to buy renovation stuff. It's a very popular store in the US. And then you have a tile shop, which is a public company, so this is not an example of it would be nice to have unlisted companies. It's much harder to get data for unlisted companies, right? So you have tile shop. So if you look at Home Depot, right, this is a large US public company. Again, what you see here is a picture that is very similar to Monsanto, okay? So Home Depot has, most of its debt is senior bonds. So the company is issuing bonds, like 96.5% of the total debt outstanding comes from the bond market. And there's a very small amount of capital leases. So they have some leased buildings. And Home Depot basically has no bank, there is zero bank debt. They do have a credit line, right? As we were talking about, even large US public companies use credit line for insurance. So you can see that they have a credit line, but they don't have any bank loans. Okay? But then you look at Tile Shop, right? That's an interesting example because that's a listed company, they're public, that's why we can get the data, but it's much smaller. When you look at the total debt outstanding of Tile Shop is only 57 million, right? So now we're going from a $20 billion company to a $57 million company. And then what you see there is that the smaller company is borrowing mostly using term loans. So now we have $47.5 million of that debt comes from bank loans, and there is also some revolving credit. So Tile Shop is actually drawing on the credit line. Okay, so almost, in fact, the total, every bit of debt that Tile Shop has is some type of bank debt. Okay, so that's a very a clear example of the type of distribution you see. Larger companies are issuing bonds, and then smaller companies are relying more on bank debt. Okay, so this is the example, and really what we need to do is we have to try to understand what's the difference between bank debt and bonds. And that's what's going to allow us to understand why are some companies relying on bonds and why other companies relying on bank debt. Okay? And here is one of the keys, right? And I kind of hinted at that already. But if you look at this data here at the bottom, this is showing you whether the debt is secure or not, right? So this shows you whether there is collateral, okay? If you look at Home Depot, almost the entire amount of debt that they issued is unsecured, meaning that there is no collateral, right? So Home Depot issues bonds to investors, and then it pays the bonds if it has cash flows. But if the company doesn't pay, then the investor has to try to recover, as we mentioned before. There is no collateral backing this debt. Whereas, when you look at Tile Shop, right, almost everything is collateralized, right? So 100% of the debt is secure. Okay? So it turns out that collateral is an important distinction, right, between bank debt and bonds. So if Tile Shop defaults, what will happen is the bank will take over the collateral. It could be the building, right? It could be some of the assets that the company owns. And whereas in the case of bonds, they are typically unsecured. So if Home Depot defaults, then as we discussed it before, bondholders take over the business. They have to try to recover something out of the assets, but there is no collateral in that case, right? So, yes.
Does this mean that every time a smaller company takes a loan, it has to anchor it to an asset?
Well, not necessarily. There is no law that says that it has to be done, but in practice, that's what happens. And you're going to see the why now. Okay? The answer is going to be that collateralizing the loan is going to affect the recovery rate that we talked about. Okay? That 40% number that I gave you before, or this picture didn't show very well, right? You know what happened here. It might be that the PDF, printing PDF doesn't work sometimes. Let's see how we do this. Yeah, I really needed this picture. Okay, so let me see if the other slide is showing. I have this picture twice. No, not here. The other is in the other class. Okay, so let me actually write it down there. Okay, I just need these two numbers for now. there's two other bars there that we'll talk about later, but those are I think those are the two only numbers that we need for now. What this shows here is the recovery rate for different types of bonds from Moody's. That's where I got this data, and I'll get the PowerPoint. It's going to show nicely in the PowerPoint, but this is probably happened when you convert it to PDF. So this bar to the right, and you might have the slides there, right? I think you Enrico told me you had the slides. So 40% is the recovery rate for unsecured bonds, which is the bar to the right. Okay, and then that bar that is closer to zero there to the left, that is the recovery rate on secured loans. Okay, and you can see that it's much higher. Okay, and I put the numbers there. The recovery rate for secured loans is 80%. I think actually this is the unsecured bonds, and this is for junior debt. So this is 40% is the recovery rate for senior. Let me add something. Now I remember. Okay, because you also have the recovery rate for junior debt. That's the one to the right. So the recovery rate for senior unsecured bonds is 40%. Is this bar here? Okay. And then you see that the recovery rate for secured loans is 80%. So when you issue a bank loan that is secured by collateral, what happens is that the bank gets a much higher recovery rate. Did you show there in your slides?
No.
There's some problem in this chart. Hopefully, I'll fix it later. Yeah. So, okay, so it's 80% versus 40. That's what we need for now. Okay. And then there is another number there. It's the recovery rate for secured bonds. So the other bar here, the second bar, let me write it down there. I apologize for that. So this is the point here, okay? So there is three recovery rates actually that we're working with. There is the recovery rate on secured loans. Bank loans is close to 80%. But then there is there is a small number of bonds. You know, most bonds are unsecured, as we saw the example for Home Depot. But there is a small market for bonds that are actually collateralized. They are secured. Okay? But as you can see, the recovery rate for secured bonds is only 65%. When companies issue collateralized loans, so when it's a bank loan, the recovery rate is higher. Okay? So banks are somehow able to get more recovery than bondholders that also have collateral. Okay? So what's going on? Why can banks get more recovery? Let me see if you have any ideas of this. So now we're comparing two types of debt. Both of them have collateral, right? But banks are getting higher recovery. Why is that? How can that be? No ideas?
Because banks are more secure.
Both are senior, actually. Yeah, could be seniority. The only junior recovery is the Junior debt, of course, is going to have lower recovery rates. We're not going to talk about junior. This is the junior debt here. Okay? If the picture was working. Yeah, good guess. But no.
Guaranteed by property asset of the...
Yeah, so that's the collateral, right? So bank loans are guaranteed by collateral, but secured bonds are also. Yeah. Contractual, right? Yes. So it turns out that bank loans have another dimension. It's not just collateral, okay? There is another dimension that matters for bank loans is what we call financial covenants. So bank debt typically comes with additional sources of control for the bank. It's not just the collateral. It has additional sources of control. Most commonly, the most important one in practice is what we call financial covenants. Okay, so what are covenants? Covenants specify conditions that a company has to comply with in order to maintain the loan. Okay, so for example, a typical covenant might say that a company has a company's profit, so EBITDA. EBITDA is operating income before depreciation. That's a common profit measure that used in covenants. EBITDA has to be greater than a certain number, X. Okay? Then what happens is, if EBITDA falls below X, the bank has the right to call the loan. So it's essentially default. Okay? So if the company does not comply with those conditions, then the bank has the right to call the loan. So just to show this in a picture, okay? So what happens is that the presence of financial covenants is going to transfer control to the bank earlier when you compare with a situation with no covenants. So suppose here you have a company that is doing poorly. Okay, so this is time in the x-axis and its profits in the y-axis. So the company's profitability is decreasing over time. Okay, EBITDA is going down, so that's a company that is, performing poorly. Okay, and then of course at some point you might have default, right? If the EBITDA becomes lower than interest, then the company is going to have trouble paying interest. Okay, what covenants do is they specify these thresholds. Okay? So what happens is, if the EBITDA falls below X, then the bank does not have to wait until the company cannot repay interest, right? In order to take control, the bank is going to take control earlier. Okay? So as soon as EBITDA falls below that threshold X, the bank is going to take control of the company. You can recall the loan, you can renegotiate, right? And that is another reason why the recovery rate is going to go up, right? So you see that secured bank loans have higher recovery rate, and what we know in the corporate finance is that this is a main reason why the presence of financial covenants is going to increase recovery rates even further. Okay, so you can think of those numbers. When you go to from 40 to 65% because of collateral, and then banks have an even higher recovery rate because they have this additional control. Okay? And now what we can do is, now that we know these differences in recovery rate, what we can do is we can see how companies can use bank debt to manage interest rates. Okay? So suppose that Monsanto, this is our company, right, that it was issuing bonds, decided to switch from bonds to bank debt. Okay? So you have a company that is issuing only bonds, right? Suppose now that, this is not the real world, it's like it's a thought exercise, right? Suppose that our company switches from bonds to bank debt. What's going to happen to the yield to maturity of the debt? Go up or down? So you're switching from bonds to bank debt. Bank debt has higher recovery, right? So, yes, right? So the bank is going to have lower credit risk. Okay? And the lower credit risk is going to mean that the bank can require a lower interest rate. That's what we're going to see here in our model. Okay? So remember we had that simple credit risk model, right, that we were using. So Monsanto's BBB bond had a recovery rate of 40%, right? And the recovery rate of 40% gave us a yield to maturity. You know, that was the price, right? That was the quoted yield to maturity. So it gave us an expected return of 2.62%, right? And the yield to maturity was close to 3. So now, suppose that Monsanto switches to bank debt, right? Switching to bank debt, according to our numbers there, should increase the recovery rate, right? So you're basically increasing the recovery rate from 40% to 80, right? And again, we're going to use that trick, right, which may not be exactly true, right? If you assume that the banker, that the bank lender demands the same expected return, we can actually use our credit risk model to back out what happens to the yield to maturity. Okay, so now we're going to go from the recovery rate to the yield to maturity. So, right, it's the same calculation here. This is the key, okay? It's highlighted in bold. So remember that for the bond, the return there was minus 60%, right? Because the recovery is 40, so the investor is losing 60%. The bank, on average, is only losing 20%, right? Because you recover 80. If the recovery was 100%, this is basically a risk-free loan, right? The bank is almost risk-free, not totally, right? But the bank is recovering 80%. So what our equation is going to tell us now, right? Now our equation that relates expected returns to yields is going to tell us that in order for the bank to have a expected return of 2.62%, you're only going to need a yield to maturity of 2.74. Okay? So you can check the math there. But what this tells us is that switching from bonds to bank debt is actually a very effective way to lower interest rates. When a company switches from bonds to bank debt, you're going to be able to borrow at a lower interest rate, right? Why are you borrowing at a lower interest rate? You're borrowing at a lower interest rate because the bank has lower credit, the bank has more control, right? So, you know, the yield to maturity that we calculated here, if you look at that data, is actually pretty close to the A rating. And the other thing we see in the data, remember the credit ratings we talked about. So if you look at the same there is a few cases where you can have the same company having both bonds and bank debt. What you see is that the bank debt typically has a higher credit rating than the bond. Okay, so there's lower, the risk of, the credit risk is lower for bank debt than bonds because of this difference in recovery. Okay? So this is, so now we have a better understanding, right, of what are the trade-offs that companies face when they choose between bonds and bank debt. Okay? So when you issue bonds, you're giving less control to investors, right? So there's no financial covenants, right, that you have to comply with. Okay? There is no collateral. Right? However, investors have lower recovery, right? Because investors have lower recovery, right? Then they're gonna have to pay higher interest. You're gonna have to pay higher interest rate. Okay? When you switch to bank debt, right? You're gonna give more control. The banker is gonna have more control. So the banker is gonna be checking your business and making sure you comply with the financial covenant. Right? The banker is going to have higher recovery, there's going to be collateral, but the benefit is you're going to be able to borrow at lower interest rate. Okay? So, this is the trade-off, so now we can think about that question, right? So, which source of that financing should a corporate financial manager choose? So let's think about this before I show, try not to look at the answer, right? So suppose you're facing this decision, right? So you can choose between a bond and bank debt, right? What would determine this? So how can you make this decision? What's going to matter here?
Interest.
Let's see some ideas. Low interest rate is going to be good. Right? But there is a cost, you have to give more control to the bank. Right? So when is it that companies are going to be most likely to go to bank loans?
When they have to.
Yeah, when they have to. But when is it that they might have to?
They don't have more guaranteed property asset to give to the bank.
Yeah, they also have to have some assets, right? If the debt is collateralized, I mean, most companies will have some kind of asset that they can use as collateral, right? It can be factories or real estate, right? Let's say that the company has collateral, okay? Some type of collateral. What type of companies, so let's think about it this way. For what type of company is going to be most important to lower interest rates?
Startups.
Startups, if they can get debt to begin with. We're going to talk about startups, actually the type of company that uses equity. We're going to talk about why, okay? But when is it most important to lower interest rates? That has to do with the trade-off model, actually.
During the maturity stage of the company, they don't want to take such risk with bonds or equity. So maybe they ask a loan and they have they take some advice or some audit control from the bank itself.
Oh, so you're thinking of a situation in which the bank is actually helping the company, giving advice, right?
Yeah.
Is that what you're, yeah, that's actually,
control. So
yeah, the bank has more, but typically banks are not giving you advice on the business. That's more the case of venture capital. That's actually going to be an
advice in their interest. I mean, so not, so they advise the company how maybe to adjust some numbers in the income statement. So
yeah. So you can get advice from the bank. That would be if the banker is helping you run the business, be it accounting or any type, that could be a variable that matters. I agree with that. Okay, but look, the benefit of lowering interest, the benefit here is lowering interest rates, right? When is it most important to lower interest rates for a company? What's the situation in the life of a company when it becomes most crucial to lower interest rates? Let's see if you... Like I said, the trade-off model is a good hint. What's the cost of that in the trade-off model? What's the financial distress, right? So
low profit.
Yeah, when a company is approaching financial distress, right? That's when it becomes most valuable to lower interest rates, right? Because for the same amount of leverage, as we learned, that's how we determine credit ratings, right? For the same amount of leverage, right? If you can find a way to lower interest rates, okay, then you're less likely to go bankrupt. Okay, so that's a very powerful observation, and you see that this is going to be one of the key determinants when we talk about cases. So when you look at the data, right, what we see is that bank debt is more important for firms that are highly levered. Okay, this is very clear in the data when you look at research on debt structure. There's a paper by Rao and Sufi. Okay, so firms that are rated A and above, when you look at the U.S. data, firms that have high credit ratings like Monsanto, for example, right, they borrow exclusively from the bond market. So there is almost no bank debt for companies with high credit ratings. But when you look at companies with lower credit ratings, so firms rated B and below, then bank debt becomes as important as bonds. Even though, these are companies that have access to bonds, right? They have credit ratings, they have bonds outstanding, but when the credit rating goes down, right, they become closer to financial default, then that's when it becomes more valuable to switch to bank loans. Okay? So what this evidence seems to be telling us is that the greater control that you're giving to bank, right? So you're essentially giving the banker more control over your business, right? This is useful, but it's costly, right? It has an implicit cost because if bank control was always good, right, then you would see every company using bank loans, and it seems to be that companies prefer to issue bonds, right? And they only resort to bank loans when they switch to banks once they approach financial distress. Okay, and we're going to see that this observation helps us understand the financing of leveraged buyouts in mergers and acquisitions, for example. Okay, so you can think of this trade-off, right, which is not obvious. You're giving more control to the bank, but you're getting a lower interest rate, right? This is useful but costly, and it becomes more useful as a company approaches financial distress. Okay? Any question on this? And I apologize for the graph that didn't show. Make sure I'll fix it because I know I'm gonna show this graph once more. I'll just fix it and I'll show you later in the afternoon class. But it's basically those numbers here. Any question on this? And what you see in the data, okay, if you look at the time series, again, the graph didn't copy well, but this is easy to explain. This is the fraction of total debt, again, coming from the Federal Reserve, the same database that I used to show you debt and equity financing. So when you look at the fraction of total debt that comes from bonds, it has increased over time, actually. So this is going from the mid-90s to the end of the 2010s, if I recall the graph correctly. So the fraction of total debt that comes from bonds has been increasing over time. So it gives us some evidence that companies actually prefer to issue bonds, right? But they resort to bank debt, at least large public companies, they resort to bank debt when they approach financial distress. Okay? All right. What time do we end today? 12:30, right? We have 20 more minutes. Okay. We can get one of the three.
Your lecture.
Seriously?
Okay, so this is what we're gonna do. We're probably not gonna have time to finish this first mini case today, but we can get started, and maybe we can even have a look at. Well, not today. This morning, right? We're meeting again in the afternoon. We'll start now, and then we'll finish it after in the afternoon class. Okay. So, right. So we saw. So far, we saw lots of theories and concepts, right? The optimal capital structure from the trade-off model, the credit ratings, right? We have our credit risk model, and then we have these arguments about debt structure. So now what I want to do is to show you how, these hopefully simple theories, how we can use these to understand corporate financing decisions in the real world. Okay, so this is the first mini case. There's going to be a few other ones. And like I said, the caveat is that all of these examples use US data, right? So that's the data that we have more easily, that my examples come from US data, but I think the concepts that they illustrate have a general use as well. Okay? So as I mentioned before, it turns out that mergers and acquisitions is a very good laboratory to study corporate financial decisions. Okay, because when you think about this, it's pretty obvious that an M&A deal is going to be one of the largest investments that companies typically make. Right, when you acquire another business, right, that's going to be on average much larger than you're trying to grow your own. Try to grow your business internally. And because these investments are so large, they can have significant impact on leverage and credit ratings. So that's going to be an example of a situation when companies can significantly change its leverage ratio through an investment decision, which is going to allow us to actually see how companies manage that. Okay, and probably one of the best examples of this is what we call a leverage buyout. Okay, a leverage buyout is a major form of an M&A deal in recent times. Since the mid '80s, that's when the LBO market was created. Okay, so I don't know if you talked about leverage buyouts before. So this, by the way, this is an example. There are many companies that are well known in the U.S. that are managed that went through leverage buyouts and are managed by private equity funds. Burger King is one example. Okay, so in the case of a leverage buyout, there are some important characteristics that are going to help us think about the financial structure of the deal here. So the acquirer is an investment company. So this is what we call the private equity funds. Okay, that's basically an investment business. It's not another. This is not another company acquiring Burger King. It's essentially a fund. It's an investment fund. Okay, and in a standard leverage buyout, what happens is that the target becomes private. So the private equity fund is going to buy all the shares of the company. So you buy all the shares of, let's say, Burger King, and then you take the company private. Okay. So these characteristics are going to be very important for the financing of the deal. Okay. So this is an example of this is how the structure of a private equity fund looks like. So you have the on the red box there are the general partner are the managers. Those are the investors who are choosing investments. They're managing the companies, etc. Okay, and then you have the limited partners are the investors who provide cash, who provide funds to the private equity fund. So these are high net worth individuals, endowments, etc. So they provide cash to the private equity fund, and then the private equity fund selects different ways to invest. So the private equity fund selects investment. For example, Burger King is an example. Okay, so this is the structure, and when you think about financing one of these leverage buyouts, right? The issue is that the acquirer in this case is a private, right? So this is a private fund, okay? It's a private equity fund, okay? So the company can, the private equity fund cannot issue equity, okay? You raise equity from your limited partner, okay? The target becomes private, right? So the target cannot issue public equity either, okay? So this is an example of an M&A deal that is a no-cash deal. So the deal has to be paid entirely in cash. Okay? And the sources of the cash have to be the debt, right? So that's why these are called leverage buyouts, because they are financed with a lot of debt, and private equity. Okay? So there is no issuance of public equity in this case. This is an example of a situation in which the private equity fund can only use debt to finance this deal. Okay, so here are a couple more examples. So Dell, these are two other companies that are owned by private equity fund. Dell, the computer company, right, was acquired in 2013 by a private equity fund called Silver Lake, and by the owner. Michael Dell was part of the acquiring team in that case. So this is a deal that was financed with a $15 billion issuance of new debt and $6 billion in cash. And another example is Heinz. Heinz was acquired in 2013 by a private equity fund called 3G Capital, and the other investor was Berkshire Hathaway. Again, they was funded with debt and cash. Okay, so here there is no option to issue equity, right? because the acquirer is a private company and the target also becomes private. Okay? So let's give an example of the magnitude of the changes in leverage that we're talking about here. So this is the Dell leverage buyout. So prior to the announcement of the leverage buyout, the LBO was announced in January 2013. Dell was trading at the market at $11 a share. Okay, so and Michael Dell, the owner, he owned, and as I said, he was part of the acquiring team in this deal. He owned 15% of the company's shares. So Michael Dell did not sell his shares. We're going to sell later. He kind of reinvested them in the company. He actually put more cash into this deal. If you use this data, with the number of shares outstanding, the total equity value of Dell prior to the deal was $19.3 billion, and the company had $7 billion of debt outstanding. Okay? So the way that the leverage buyout is structured, what happens is the private equity fund buys all outstanding shares, right? In this case, because Michael Dell was investing in the deal, then they didn't have to buy out his shares. So they bought 85% of the shares. That's why you have the 85% number here. Okay? And of course, every time there is an M&A deal, M&A deals happen at a premium. Okay? So there was a 25% premium for that deal. So they remember that the stock price was $11. They bought it for $13.65. Okay? And if you do the calculation here, so Dell had 1.757 billion shares outstanding, so they bought 85% of the shares, so they required $20.4 billion in financing. Okay, so that they had to raise $20.4 billion in cash in order to do a leverage buyout of Dell. Okay? So this is what the remember that we're going to talk about capital structure, right? So this is what the capital structure of Dell looked like prior to the leverage buyout. So they had $7 billion in debt. The market value of equity was 19.3. Okay? So if you use, I have written there, the leverage ratio that I'm emphasizing here is the ratio of debt to the market value of assets, right? Then market value of assets is debt plus equity. So you can do the calculation there. The leverage ratio is going to be 26.6%. Okay? So remember that 30% number we did earlier in the morning today, right? So Dell was pretty close to that leverage ratio, right? So how was the LBO financed? There was a new debt issuance of $15 billion. Michael Dell invested his own cash, so he took his own cash to invest in the company. So not only he didn't sell his shares, he took $750 million of his own savings in order to invest in the leverage buyout and take the company private. And the private equity fund invested $1.4 billion. And then there is some left over here that was funded mostly with the company's own cash. So essentially they did a stock repurchase. They took some of the company's own cash, 3.1 billion in this case, and used it to buy back some of the shares as well. Okay? So this is what it's gonna. So now what you can see here is the magnitude of the change in capital structure that happens following a leverage buyout, right? So debt went up from, it was $7 billion, right? But they had to issue $15 billion of new debt in order to finance this deal. Okay? So debt is going to go to $22 billion. Okay? And now we have to estimate, what happens to the market value of assets, right? Equity is assets minus debt. But we have to figure out what happens to the assets. Okay? Is the value of the assets going to be constant at 26.3 or not? What do you think? This is the same? No, right? Something is happening because they are paying a premium, right? So the acquirer is paying a premium for the assets, meaning that the value of the assets has to increase. Okay? So here we don't have any data, to estimate this. We don't have any data on. The problem is because the company goes private. We don't have data on post LBO stock prices. Okay, but the value of the assets is likely going to increase because the buyer is paying a premium. So we can use that premium, right? The premium is 25% of the equity. We can use this premium to estimate what happens to the market value of assets following the deal. 25% of the market value of equity in this case is going to be 4.8 billion. Of course, hopefully value will increase even more, right? But it has to increase at least by the amount of the premium. Okay. So redoing here the balance sheet of the company market values, the assets increased then to 31.1. They were 26.3. If you increase them by the magnitude of the premium, they go up. But that increased so much, right, that the company's new leverage ratio after the LBO went to 71%. Okay, so that's our estimate. So there was, right, so now we can go back to the trade-off model, right, that we talked, that you learned with Professor Salvi and we were recapping before, right? Because we know from our analysis of the trade-off model that this is what the picture looks like, right? So when a company has leverage close to 30%, then you're closer to the optimal capital structure, right? And if you move away from that, then you're losing value, okay? So what we can do is we can try to place Dell here in this figure, right? So that's why I like to do the picture of the trade-off model using numbers, right? Using the 30%, because now we can think about, what happens in real-world cases. So here you have Dell, right? Pre-LBO, they were pretty close to the optimal capital structure, right? So the debt to assets ratio was 27%, so they were close to that peak, right? Essentially, what's happening following the leverage buyout is that the company is becoming over-levered, right? There is too much leverage, and Dell is clearly moving to the right of that picture, right? So if Dell is like the median public firm in the U.S., then the leverage buyout is causing a significant increase in leverage, right? That is way above the optimal capital structure. Okay, so this is what this slide is saying here. The increase in leverage is a very typical situation in leverage buyout deals, right? Because they are financed by debt issuance and cash. There is no equity issuance. There is going to be an increase. This increase in leverage is going to increase the cost of capital and reduce value by a few percentage points. There is a situation in which there is over leverage, right? And now we go back to what we were talking about using recovery rates, etc., right? So if leverage is too high, right, then you're in a situation in which the risk of financial distress is increasing a lot, right? So the company has a risk that it might have difficulty making future interest payments, and the private equity funds have to be very careful with how they structure the financing of a deal in order to address this problem. Okay, so let me see here. That's a good time to stop. So maybe let's stop now, and in the afternoon we'll pick up from here, and then I'm going to show you what private equity funds do in order to address this high leverage problem that we identified here. Right. So essentially, what happens is, following a leverage buyout, targets become over-levered, they have leverage that is too high, and then there are several financing moves that private equity funds do in order to address this problem that we're going to talk about in the afternoon. Okay, so let's stop now. Thank you. Thank you for the first.